bit to learn about this 40. G'day and welcome back to the 40 channel. I've had some stuff going on in the background for probably 5 weeks now that I've just been slowly tinkering away with while I've been getting ready for prepping of paint and all that stuff. So in between those bits I've been doing some stuff, and that's the power steering. Now this 2H power steering unit's come from Mr. Land Cruiser. He's helped me out because what he's done is he's just ripped it straight off a car and he said, I'm sending it to you untested, uncleaned. So he's doing me a bit of a favour. He's helped me out there, and and the reason he's done that is to make it cheaper for me and less work for him down there. Now I did that. I told him on the phone that's fine. I'm happy to accept that because what I'll do is I'll do a full rebuild on it. But one thing I did notice was because it was so oily and grimy, especially at the back here, it really led me to believe that more than likely the seal in the back here has blown out and it does need a rebuild regardless. So we're going to strip down the power steering unit, put a whole new seal kit through it, rebuild it, should be good as new. Righto, first thing is we've got to remove the front pulley. So just a 19mm bolt, clamp it in the vise, strip that out. Righto, to get this off you could be lucky and just could tap it off. You could use a puller. Now this would be the easiest and best way of doing it. Now not everyone has a puller. So I'm going to show you how to get it off with what you might have at home. Now I've soaked all mine overnight with some WD-40 on all the bolts and all around the shaft to make things a little bit easier. And I recommend doing that. Let all that penetration oil get in so that makes things easier later. All I'm going to do is just get a pin punch, a big pin punch and a hammer, and I'm going to come into the back and give it a tap, and hopefully it'll tap off. Righto, so we're just going to get the pin punch and we're just going to tap just around here, and we can move it as we tap. That's coming off beautifully. There we go. Righto, you got a little keyway. Remove the key. It's a little Woodruff key. Don't lose that. Right, so we're going to move the suction port. So we've just got a 12mm bolt here. There'll be an O-ring under here. Okay, you can see that O-ring is pretty squashed and certainly needs replacing. Right, now it's time to remove the front housing. We've got 4 14mm bolts. So I'll rip them off. Righto, for these two I've actually had to swap over to a non-impact drive because I need the thinner wall to fit on. Let's spin that around the other way now. Just very carefully pull that off. There we go. So now we want to disassemble this front unit. So this is actually called a vane pump, and that spins around, and as that spins around the centrifugal force pushes these vanes out onto this cam lobe, and that captures your fluid and pumps it around. Again, you can see this O-ring is pretty flat too, but let's focus on the front of the housing first. Right, the next thing we need to do is remove this oil seal. So there's a couple of ways we can go about it. If you've got some type of pulley, you can pull that out and remove it. You can try and chisel underneath it, but I don't recommend that because you can crack or break this housing here. If you have a look at this oil seal, you can see that it's pretty shagged around here. What I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and drill 2 little holes, put some screws in there and try and pry it off. Just get a pin punch, Just got a small 2.5mm drill. Right, I've drilled those 2 holes. Now I know some of you are thinking that, what am I doing? I'm drilling these holes and there's a possibility of swarf getting inside here. Well, it doesn't matter. We're stripping the entire thing down and we're rebuilding it. So we can change the bearings, we're changing all the seals. I would rather try to get this out without damaging the outer housing. Put our wood screw in. First, I'm just going to try to grab hold of that wood screw and pry it off the shaft. Fantastic. Well, that came off heaps easier than I thought it would, so that's good. So hopefully you guys have that much success when you're pulling yours off. Righto, so now we've exposed this, you can actually see that water has been leaking inside, and there's some, well, it doesn't look pretty. It looks terrible actually. So I'm going to pull out that circlip. Circlip out. We'll turn it over and we should be able to knock it straight out. Alright, so we're just going to try and remove these 2 locating pins, or these dowel pins. Now what I've got is aluminium soft jaws in my vise, so I'm going to clamp it between the aluminium soft jaws and we'll just try and work them free. Just line the jaws up with the end of the vise. Just slowly move that backwards and forwards. It's 1 pin. Try and get the other pin out. Two pins, and that way you're not going to damage the pin whatsoever. They come out perfect condition. The soft jaws save all that. Now what we can do, just going to get a tap here with a soft blow hammer. Just put your hand underneath it so we can catch the shaft and the bearing. Beautiful. So that's all come out. As you can see, there's a bit of water damage and stuff in that bearing, so we want to replace that bearing anyway. And that bearing feels pretty notchy. It's not very pretty, so we don't like that. So we're going to replace the bearing. Like I said, if you're worried about swarf getting in there, who cares? You're replacing the bearing, so don't worry about that. Clean up the inside of the housing. A little bit of goopy, rusty stuff in there. I don't know if you can see that, but when I wipe it away with my finger, all the machine surfaces are absolutely beautiful. So there's no pitting, there's no rust. So I think we've saved that, which is good. Yeah, that's in fantastic condition. Just make sure that all your machined surfaces are clean and there's no scoring or damage on them. Throttle cleaner, because that's all I've got left lying around. There you go, your little ripper, that's come up fantastic. Righto, to remove this bearing, we just have this little clip here. I'll actually show you what the spare one looks like. So that's the spare that comes in the kit. Righto, so we'll just chuck that in the jaws, the soft jaws. Try and get on that. Okay, that's actually bending that clip off. Just see it's starting to bend it off. Not that that's a concern because we're going to replace it anyway. Seems to be a bit jammed around this side, but we'll get that off. Alright, that's come off. It's damaged, but don't worry, we've got a brand new one. We can knock that bearing out. So all we're going to do is just sit that on those soft jaws. A dead blow hammer, we'll give it a tap from the top. Bearing is off the shaft. Perfect. Just gotta be careful pulling that out. Oops. So all our veins are falling out, that's okay. Now if you pull it out, your veins might fall out. That's okay, because what I'll do is I'll show you how we know which way they go back in. because it's important they go back in the same way. So let's get all our vanes out. Take our cam out. Just be really careful pulling him out with pliers. We don't want to damage any of these surfaces. Righto, some of the vanes fell out, but that's okay, because I'm actually going to pull each vane out, give it a bit of a clean, and you can actually see on one side of this vane, we've got like see if we can show you, a shiny side and a dull side. If you turn it over, the whole side is consistent, there's no markings. So that tells me that this part here is the working side. So it goes in, okay, your vane slides in and out, like that. As the vane pump spins around, the vanes come out, capture your fluid, bring it back around the lobe and push, and then they slide back in, following the cam back around. So we're cleaning up every single vane. I've laid out all the vanes the same way up and all facing the same way. So when I go to put it back together, I know that the top shinier side sits in the vane, and that's the way it works. And this is the top. Give that a quick clean up. The bottom of the vane housing has this tiny little indent, so I know that's going to be my bottom, so that's my indicator. Came out of the housing like that. Right, now it's all clean. I'm going to put all these vanes back in the correct way. Just take note of which way they came out, so you can put them back in the exact same way in case you're not sure. If we look really carefully on the end of this vane, the top edge, or the edge that runs around the cam, has actually got a slight little radius to it. I don't know if this GoPro is going to pick it up. And the bottom edge is actually a square flat edge. So that's another indicator of which way they go in. Righto, get our new bearing, slide it back onto the shaft, and we're actually going to wind this right up so it doesn't bite, but it's just off it. And then we can tap this back down to drive the bearing back home. Perfect. Pull that back out, sit it in the other way. Just going to get our little retainer clip, use our snap ring pliers here. Just open it up, slide that straight down, clip straight on. Perfect. Just done like that. Righto, just inside here you can probably just see it, we've got our brass seat. So what I'm going to use is a screw extractor. The screw extractor will grab hold of that. Here we go. Beautiful. So that came out quite easy. And I just saw it's just got a bit of pitting, well, not pitting, but just around there. And I thought, well, we get a new one in the kit, so we may as well take it out and replace it as well. Just going to run an M6 tap straight down this little hole here so that we can get a bolt in there and try and pull that out. We'll do that before we pull out the circlip. It's full of all sorts of junk and crap. So on the back of this is another seal that we want to replace. Okay, we'll pull that tap back out. You see we've got this circlip, so we'll just get the circlip pliers on this. This one's a little bit trickier. Combination of a little hook and my circlip pliers. We're going to try to circlip pliers in there, put the hook up underneath it, just help us get this out because it doesn't want to. There we go, got it out. A little bit tricky because this part here just catches on the outside of that thread. Alright, let's see if we can pull that out. Let's grab a little M6 bolt. Screw that in there, and then hopefully we should be able to pull it out. Perfect. Righto, so you can see the O-ring on the back there, so we'll replace that O-ring as well. We've got a spring in here. As everything, we'll just clean everything up as we pull it all apart. What we're actually going to do is we're going to rip this O-ring straight off. And we'll go straight to our new kit. You can see this O-ring is actually quite square. And it's got some, it's pretty much buggered. It's quite square and it's got some pitting on the end of these O-rings. Pretty much the same as all the other O-rings that I've found throughout this teardown. We'll put the new O-ring straight on there. Here's our new rebuild kit. We've already used the clip for the bearing. We'll get our new O-ring and we'll start putting it all back together. There's our old O-ring. There's our new O-ring. Put it on top to make sure that you're picking up the exact right O-ring. You don't want to pick up the wrong one. The new O-ring on. Take the old one and put it away. We don't want to get them mixed up. Righto, so we're going to use everything new out of the rebuild kit. So we'll put our new O-ring in, drop the spring back in. We'll just screw our little bolt back into there. We're going to push down and we'll put our retainer on at the same time. So this could be a little bit of a juggle. Okay, there we go. We'll just try and push that down. Circlip in. It's just sitting there, so we just want to relocate that with our screwdriver. Pop that circlip in place. Done. Righto, so that's all in place. You can actually feel that spring pushing up and down now, so that's actually working. Before it wasn't, it was all bound up. Righto, time for our next O-ring. So we'll pop this O-ring off. Take the old ring away. There's our new O-ring, double checking the size. Get rid of that. Pop our new O-ring back on. Just using that power steering fluid that's sitting all around it, just rub that over the O-ring. Drop the spring back into place. Okay, now we've got the spring in place. Just push that down onto that spring. Feel it just pushing down on it. Drop our lobe back on top. Really carefully, we're going to pick up our vane housing with all our vanes in it. Get up on the side. We dropped one vane, but that's okay. We'll just push that back in. Okay, slide that in. Just give it a push with your hands if you can. And you'll actually feel that seated in there nicely now. Sit that up there. A bit of a tap with the soft blow hammer. You don't have to hit it very hard. You'll hear it go in. Now we want to put the circlip on the top of this. Again, we've got a brand new circlip. All comes with the kit. I'm just going to mount that in, give it a bit of a push and you'll hear it snap into place. Now we've got our brand new seal. Make sure that all this is nice and clean again. We don't want any fluff or dirt sitting in here because once we put it in, it's in. Okay, we're going to sit that O-ring seal over the top. We don't want to damage any of this. What we want to try and do now is trying to find the right size socket that we can sit over that so that we can tap that in. I'm going to find a socket. Right, 1 1/4 socket sits absolutely perfect over that seal. If you've got a bearing installation kit, absolutely use it. I don't have one at home, and I'm showing you what you can use at home instead of having to go out and buy all this stuff. So give it a bit of a tap from the top, again with a dead blow hammer. just take it easy. You'll hear it home. Righto, so that's nice and flush. We don't want to use a pin punch around here, definitely not, otherwise you'll damage that seal very quickly. Turn the top housing over. We want to put our 2 locating pins back in. Again, just line them up. Dead blow hammer, just tap them in. Right, we're going to take a different approach. Right, we put our vane housing on our shaft so we can get all those splines lined up. Make sure all our vanes are in. I'm going to throw our O-ring over the top. We're then going to get our lobe. We're going to line it up with our locating pins. Right, we've got our lobe, our vanes, all lined up with our center spline, our O-ring on. Right, now we can get our bottom housing. Remember that spring, we've pushed that spring down to relocate that. It shouldn't pop back up, but just be aware that that is under spring tension. Carefully turn this over. Slide it all on very carefully. And just give it a bit of a twist so we can line it all up. Perfect. Turn that back over. Throw in our bolts. Just give it a spin every now and then to make sure that everything's aligned, that nothing's binding up. Before there was no seal around the top. It is basically totally perished, so it was as loose as a goose. So it will feel a little bit tight, but it means that everything is sealing up beautifully. Which is exactly what we want. I'm not going to do that up with a rattle gun. I'm just going to do them up with a spanner, just working side to side, just to pull it down nice and evenly. Alright, now we can go and do these up nice and tight. Again, making sure that we've got spin on that shaft. Let's flip it over. As you remember before, we pulled out our last brass seal, and it was actually scored on the top. So the kit came with a new one, so I thought, what the heck, let's put a new one in. And what we're going to do now is just going to give it a slight little tap, just to get that bedded in. Righto, that's come up beautiful now, super clean. That's excellent. Alright, last thing left to do is push this back in. It's the cleanest and shiniest thing of the whole pump now. New seals, new bearings, new retainer clips, new brass seals on the inlets. Everything's been cleaned out, and it should last me another 20 odd years before it needs another rebuild. Righto guys, that's it. So thanks for watching. I hope this power steering pump rebuild's been helpful to you guys. I really appreciate you guys' support. It's been fantastic. So don't forget to subscribe down the bottom, hit the bell, feel free to leave a comment, check out my Instagram page, and if you guys want your builds featured on the inspiration section, which is coming up next, send me an email, 4045channel@gmail.com, all in the description down below, and send me a little bit of a story, about 20 odd photos of your build, and even a couple of video clips if you like as well. And we'll be able to feature your project on the inspirations. Anyway guys, take care of yourselves, and until next time, thanks. Today on Inspirations, we're going to check out Chuck's 1966 FJ45LV. Chuck's interest in Land Cruisers first started back way in the 70s when he was at high school, where him and a mate with a Land Cruiser would kick around North California. But Chuck's first FJ40 was a 1972. Bit of rust and a bit of prime, but he only paid $1,500 for it back in 1988. Only owning it for a year and then selling it to someone who wanted it more than he did and making a bit of cash on it. Then a few years later, in '93, Chuck ended up selling his 1969 Corvette Convertible, which he had had for 12 years, to go and buy a 1969 FJ40, which he only spent $1,300 on it. Then put another couple $1,000 into it over the next couple of years before it was ready for some family touring, camping and wheeling trips. But only after 5 years they decided they needed to upgrade. So they ended up selling it, ended up buying a Chevy Suburban, a more practical truck, but not as fun. Chuck tells me he went a fair few years without having a fun car. So then, in 2004, Chuck decided it was time to get something a little bit more fun in his life again, and went out and bought himself a 1963 Chevy Nova SS, then moving on to a 1967 GTO. Chuck loved this car, and he was sure that this was the car that he was going to own until the day he died and the boys would have to fight over it. But then, in around 2015, one of Chuck's sons came up to him and said, "Dad, one of the most memorable times of my life was when we used to own the old FJ40 red truck and go out camping and touring as a family. Dad, can you help me find one?" Chuck was pretty excited, and it just so happened he had a friend that had a Capri Blue 1970 FJ40 for sale, and made a smoking deal for his son to pick it up on. After a year or so of driving it around, one of the piston rings broke, number 6. Chuck did a complete teardown and rebuild of the motor. And after spending a year or so back and forward to the Land Cruiser graveyard, he started to catch the bug. Then after swapping out the engine earlier in February, Chuck got bit hard by the FJ bug again. So Chuck did something that he never normally does. He rang a mate and told him that he was in the market for a new FJ. After asking him a few different questions, how much he wanted to spend, project versus no project, V8 versus standard, Chuck told him he was not after a project, but he really wanted something in spring green. Chuck's mate said, "I might have something up here for you." In the last weekend in February, Chuck and his son jumped in his son's FJ40 newly built engine and headed down to see Roger, who was pretty impressed with how the motor sounded. Roger said to him, "Let's go see what you can find you." After opening up a barn that had 3 FJ40s pretty much fully restored, ready to go, and around the right price, they looked pretty good, but none of them really grabbed Chuck. The seller had a huge sneaky grin on his face. He said to Chuck, "I think I might have something you would like." Took him over to a shipping container. Without saying much more, they moved a decrepit old ladder, some old tyres, some old drums, and pushed out an old Camaro out of the way, opened up this shipping container to see some type of variant of FJ under a cover. The cover got lifted up to reveal a long badge of a 45LV Toyota Land Cruiser. And it was spring green! Chuck could see it was obviously an abandoned project. It turns out that he had bought it from a winery in 2001 and drove it fairly regularly until March 2005. He'd started to restore it, boxed and bagged everything that came off it, painted the inside and outside in spring green, but at some point ran into some obstacles which caused him to lose traction, get involved in some other projects, shoving it into a shipping container, covering it and closing the door, never to look at it again until Chuck came calling. Chuck was hooked. He spent about 10 minutes checking it out and asked what spares he had for it. He was told that he had all the glass, switches, wiring, interior, pretty much everything. Chuck thought the price was fair and asked him to give him a couple of weeks to sell his beloved GTO, and they shook on the deal. Chuck loved his GTO, but he wasn't enjoying it anymore, if that makes sense. But he knew he would have a lot more fun with this new project. When they got to Roger's place, the LV was already out of the container and on a lift in the garage. It had been dragged out of the container due to frozen brake drums, and the skid marks were there to prove it. Now home, Chuck had a plan of attack. Immediately putting it on jack stands, took off the wheels and started looking at the locked brakes. Apparently it had all been done as part of the first step in the restoration, before the last owner painted it, then lost interest. To be sure, he pulled up every drum, inspected for leaks, broken parts, etc. Everything was okay. Checked oil pressure, fuel in the carb, reattached everything, and reached for the first click of the key. It was a bit sticky, but it fired up. Chuck was just getting ready to shut it down when he noticed the fuel gashing out of the top of the carby.
Now.
Forward now?
Yeah.
It's all frothing around.
That'll do it, yeah. Funny.
Hearing it run motivated Chuck and realised that even considering the amount of work that was looking at, Chuck got a fantastic deal on the Cruiser and knew that virtually every car project in his entire life had prepared him for this one. Chuck is also inspiring his granddaughter into the 40 series, converting this little toy car into a ripper copy of his FJ40. Chuck, I have to admit, it was the spring green that drew me to your project. Chuck, you've come full circle in your 40 series story, starting your car journey with an FJ40 back in the 80s and inspiring 2 generations of family members along the way for your love of cruisers. With a number of beautiful vehicles in between, you've come back to a project that I'm sure will bring you much joy and satisfaction. Not only to you, but also to your family and some of your close mates too. Good on you, mate. Thanks for sharing your story and letting me share your story with the rest of the world. Really appreciate it. Anyway, guys, take care of yourselves, and until next time, see you around.